Some Christians just love to debate. I'm not one of them, but I definitely used to be. There's this little old verse in Matthew that has caused quite a bit of discussion in the last 30 to 40 years. The main discussion revolves around Matthew 22, verse 13, which says this: "Then the king said to the servants, 'Bind him hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.'" Well, what are all these people that are debating about this verse saying? Well, the first group says the outer darkness refers to unbelievers who will go to hell and face eternal separation from God. Others say it refers to believers who will be in the future earthly kingdom, but will be led out of the opening feast and experience great remorse and grief for an unfaithful life. And then there's that old Catholic that yelled, "Purgatory, purgatory," whatever that means. Before I go any further, I want to be clear about a couple of things that will probably make more sense after you watch this entire video for the second time. Number one, Christians should fear the outer darkness at the wedding feast in the kingdom, but it shouldn't be our only and main motivation to live a holy life. Number two, if premillennialism is wrong, then my entire interpretation of this passage is useless and should be discarded. So, what does this verse about the outer darkness really mean? Shall we begin with reading the entire passage from Matthew 22, verses 1 to 14. This is what it says. Jesus spoke to them again in a parable, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. And he sent out his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding feast, and they were unwilling to come. Again he sent out other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, behold, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fattened livestock are all butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast.' But they paid no attention and went their way, one to his own farm, another to his business. And the rest seized his slaves and mistreated them and killed them. But the king was enraged, and he sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main highways, and as many as you find there, invite to the wedding feast.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered together all they found, both evil and good, and the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. But when the king came to look over the dinner guests, he saw a man there who was not dressed in wedding clothes. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you come in here without wedding clothes?' And the man was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, 'Bind him hand and foot, and send him into the darkness outside. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" Now for the interpretation and a brief comparison of the views. Also, I'd like to associate my view with the partaker's view, so here we go. A king has invited the whole world to attend a great feast at the beginning of his reign as king. This feast isn't necessarily free to get into, though. The invitation to the feast and his new kingdom is surely free to accept, but one was responsible to buy his own clothes to actually enjoy the celebration feast. Also, on multiple other occasions, which is other verses in the Bible, the king told everyone who was invited how to obtain the right clothes to wear into the feast. Surely, for the garments appropriate for this feast is no small amount to pay. These clothes will cost a person his very life. In this parable, there are 4 different kinds of people in the world, and they responded in 4 different ways to King Jesus' offer of the feast. The first group made excuses and said that they weren't coming. This refers to the many people in Israel who rejected Jesus as their Messiah, and it might refer to all unbelievers during the church age, but the focus is Israel. Basically, this proves that the nation of Israel rejected their Messiah. See verse 5 in chapter 22. The second group was publicly hostile to the new king's invitation. I take this to represent the Pharisees. See verses 6 to 7. The third group is the group you want to be in. They listened to the invitation and they accepted it. Not only did they come to the feast, they showed up dressed with the appropriate clothes on. This represents the justified believer who lived a faithful life on earth and endured all of God's training to become holy as He is holy. This group was full of faithful disciples to the end. This road isn't easy, but it will be well worth it in order to serve the King. See verse 10. The fourth and last group listened to the invitation, but they did not arrive in the right clothes, so they were not allowed to stay and enjoy the feast. The loving King had to send them out of the feast. Surely the loving King was sad to do so, for he wanted everyone to be a part of the feast. The King couldn't allow all to stay if they didn't do what he said to do before arriving. This last group represents the justified believer who lacks a life of good works. See verse 11. Therefore, in this parable, there are two types of unregenerate unbelievers and two types of regenerate believers in the world. Let's break this down a little more. Verses 1 to 9 is primarily a warning to the Pharisees. The first verse says them, which references the Pharisees in the previous context. In Revelation 19:9, the kingdom is not the same thing as the introductory wedding feast of the Lamb. The feast precedes the 1,000-year kingdom in Revelation 20 verses 1 to 6, and in Matthew 25 verses 1 to 13. Therefore, all believers will be in the kingdom, but not all will be in the banquet. See verses 5 to 7 for the two types of unbelievers in this parable. Verse 7 is particularly interesting as it refers to the coming destruction of Jerusalem, which Jesus speaks about in Matthew 24 verse 2. Verses 9 to 10 introduces the people who were properly dressed. But what's interesting here is that these verses show how the invitation was originally only to Israel, but because they rejected the Messiah, Jesus stopped his initial kingdom offer to Israel and offered entrance to the kingdom to the whole world, both Gentiles and Jews. They were told to go out into the main highways. So this is where we're currently at in the Bible story. The kingdom is postponed as the invitation of justification and discipleship for all people gets spread around the world. If you are watching this video thinking it has no practical meaning, think again. Let's do our part and get the message out there and make some more disciples. See my video on Alva J. McLean and the kingdom for more details on this topic. Also, for an easier read, see Dr. Andrew Wood's book on the coming kingdom. It's quite excellent. By the way, Jesus never calls people just to be justified and not to go any further in the Christian life than just getting saved. His call goes much further than that. He urges and calls, but doesn't require or force people to lose their life for him. I urge the viewers of this video to do the very same. Lose your life for Christ so that ultimately you will find it. And note this, losing your life for Christ does not impact a right or wrong standing with God. Now for verses 11 to 14, which will be my main discussion. First, let's discuss the wedding clothes that were required to enjoy the feast in verse 11. The garments are made clear in Revelation 19 verses 7 to 8 as righteous acts of those who are justified. These righteous acts make one worthy to enjoy the feast. That goes for the person watching this video too. Therefore, to simply be in the kingdom, only justification is necessary. But to enjoy the feast and reign in a high position with Christ, one must have the righteous acts of the saints. But the perseverance of the saints' view can't be correct here. And why do we ask that? Because they say that this person who didn't have on the right clothes was unregenerate. There's a problem with that though, because he's inside the kingdom already, let alone he was in the feast too. The man is referred to as a friend, and by the authority of Jesus Christ, John 3:5 indicates he was regenerate. Therefore, the Reformed Calvinist interpretation doesn't fly. That boat don't float. Moving back to the partaker's interpretation. The consequences of being led out of the feast are terrible. You don't want to be that unfaithful Christian. Now for the phrase, bind him hand and foot. This refers to the fact that the faithful Christian will reign with Christ, but the unfaithful one will be stopped and not be over much or possibly anything at all in the coming kingdom. He will at least be bound to do nothing but grieve during the inaugurational feast. By the way, this is a good time to tell you that justified believers will indeed experience remorse and regret at the feast and when judged by Christ at the judgment seat. Are you ready? And now to discuss cast out. The word in Greek is ekbalo and should be translated as let out or send out in this context. It does not have to mean cast out, as most translations render it. See Luke 4:1, John 10:4, James 2:25, Mark 1:12, Mark 9:38, and definitely Mark 1:43. So the verse should read like this, and sent him into the darkness outside. Now we're moving to discuss the outer darkness, or the darkness outside of the feast. The Calvinists will typically interpret this to be hell, but let's not jump to conclusions too fast now. I don't think they're right. This phrase depends heavily on the context, and in my opinion, in some cases it refers to hell, in other cases it refers to the darkness outside of the feast of the inauguration of the kingdom. Context must be our guide. I'd highly recommend you see Dillow's discussion of this exact topic on page 773 of his book Final Destiny. I mean it, check it out. By the way, this is a good time to mention that this whole passage is a parable and the darkness outside is a figure of speech. There is no literal place that is full of darkness in Jesus' kingdom. These are symbols that indicate unfaithful Christians will face severe grief, be angry at themselves, and even despair at this time because of their wasted lives. Let me give you a quick quote from the Louw-Nida on this exact phrase. They will be thrown into outer darkness. Matthew 8:12. In a number of languages, this expression in Matthew 8:12 must be rendered as, they will be thrown outside where it is dark. That's interesting. It seems he agrees with my interpretation. By the way, trying to argue against this interpretation with John 12:46, Matthew 5:14-16, and Luke 16 verse 8 is what's called illegitimate identity transfer in Dillow's book. Missing the banquet is no small inconvenience either. The unfaithful Christian will not only miss the wedding feast, but will be rebuked by Christ and will not reign with Christ for 1,000 years and possibly throughout all of eternity. That's quite a big motivation to live holy, if you ask me. And quite honestly, I'm terrified of missing out on that. Now to deal with weeping and gnashing of teeth. This references the fact that Christians who are led into the darkness outside of the feast will experience great remorse and regret for how they wasted their Christian life. You may ask, how do I know it refers to regret? Well, see Jeremiah 9:17-22, Jeremiah 9:10, Jeremiah 31:15, and Amos 5:16. Every time weeping and gnashing of teeth is used does not always refer to hell. Yet again, context must be our guide. God weeps bitterly over our sin, and if he can do it, so can the carnal Christian. See Isaiah 22 verse 14. To sum it up, God will reward both the good and the bad at the judgment seat. Each man and woman will get what he is due at that time. See 2 Corinthians 5 verse 10. Also, I'd like you to take some time to review this chart for further study. It is taken from Dillow's book. Finally, to deal with the many are called, but few are chosen. According to the Lord, many are called to personal salvation and to enter the kingdom, but only a few who are wearing the garments clothed with righteous acts of the saints will be chosen to enter the feast. Don't you want to be one of those saints? Don't you want to hear the Lord say, "Well done, my good and faithful servant"? If you enjoyed this video, I'd highly suggest you pick up Joseph Dillow's book, Final Destiny. By the way, though Calvinism has deeply enriched many lives over the past 450 years, Dillow says a grenade has been lobbed into the hallowed halls of Westminster Calvinism. I'm here to agree that this grenade has been lobbed on Lordship salvation and perseverance of the saints. I don't think these particular views within Calvinism represents the scriptures well. If the partner's view is correct, a central doctrine of Westminster Calvinism is simply wrong. I hope you enjoyed the video. You can also like and subscribe to my channel for more animated Bible and theology. And please get Dillow's book. Have an awesome day.